Looking at the map, China appears unstoppable with its 1.4 billion people, the world's largest navy, and its ability to build cities at an unprecedented pace. As the factories and military might seem to send a clear message that the East is rising while the West declines, making the outcome appear mathematically inevitable. However, examining efficiency rather than sheer scale reveals a striking reality that challenges this narrative entirely. California, home to a diverse population of just 39 million people, generates a GDP of $3.9 trillion, while China, with all its resources and massive population, reaches $18 trillion. This means that on a per capita basis, one Californian produces the same economic value as 35 Chinese citizens, a staggering disparity that demands explanation. The question becomes, how does a civilization that manufactures everything from iPhones to shoes fail to match the efficiency of a state primarily focused on software and entertainment? The answer isn't simply communism, but rather a specific economic pattern that originated in 1433, illustrated through the story of Hui Kaiyan, who 5 years ago embodied China's economic miracle as the founder of Evergrande and Asia's richest man. Wearing gold Hermes belts to political rallies and representing the unstoppable rise. Today he sits in prison while his company represents a $300 billion debt crater with thousands of empty, deteriorating towers standing as monuments to failure. His story reveals that China operates more as a Ponzi scheme disguised as a superpower, built on volume rather than value. And this fatal flaw traces back 6 centuries to 1433, predating even Mao's revolution by hundreds of years. To understand why China in 2026 cannot fix its economy, one must understand the operating system it runs on, a system installed exactly 600 years ago, in 1405, decades before Christopher Columbus even contemplated ocean voyages. China dominated the seas under Admiral Zheng He, who commanded a treasure fleet of over 300 ships, some stretching 400 feet long and carrying thousands of sailors along with exotic cargo like giraffes from Africa and gold from India, dwarfing Columbus's 85-foot Santa Maria by comparison. China possessed the technology, resources, and capability to colonize the world, discover America, and control European trade routes, potentially becoming the British Empire for centuries early. Yet in 1433 the emperor made a fateful decision that haunts the country to this day, fearing that wealthy merchants gaining power and wealth from international trade would be difficult to control. Recognizing that such individuals would have their own power and ideas independent of imperial authority, he stopped the voyages, burned the fleet, destroyed the blueprints, and made it a capital crime to build ships with more than 2 masts. China chose control over growth, preferring to be the king of a walled garden rather than competing in the open ocean. And this same pattern repeated in October 2020 when the Communist Party effectively burned its modern fleet. Though this time the admiral wasn't named Zheng He but Jack Ma. As a former English teacher who built Alibaba into an e-commerce giant rivaling Amazon, Jack Ma represented innovative, forward-thinking China, charismatic and proof that the country could do more than assemble plastic toys and could invent the future. On October 24, 2020, he made a critical mistake by standing on a stage at the Bund Summit in Shanghai before the most powerful bankers and regulators in the country and telling the truth, criticizing Chinese state-owned banks by comparing them to institutions that only lend to people who don't need money and accusing regulators of stifling innovation in a moment of pure free speech. The reaction was swift and devastating. 2 days later he was summoned by regulators. The massive Ant Group IPO that was set to be the biggest in history was cancelled overnight, and Jack Ma simply disappeared from public view for 3 months, emerging quieter, broken, and diminished. Why would a country desperate for economic growth destroy its most successful entrepreneur and wipe out $300 billion in value overnight? The answer lies in understanding that Chinese banks aren't businesses but rather the party's wallet, existing to fund the government's political projects including bridges to nowhere, high-speed trains that lose money, and massive stadiums. And Jack Ma's company was using technology to lend money more efficiently than the state banks, making him not just a competitor but an existential threat to the party's control over money. Just like the emperor in 1433, Xi Jinping struck a match and burned the modern treasure fleet to save the bureaucracy. And this represents the crime scene, the moment the superpower dream died. Because no Silicon Valley can exist where Steve Jobs figures are arrested every time they speak their minds. The rot extends deeper than one individual, revealed through careful examination of the factories and the label, made in China, that appears on almost every object in our houses, creating the psychological anchor of China's power and convincing us they are the engine room of the global economy, suggesting that if they stop, the world stops. However, picking up an iPhone and looking closer reveals a phrase that is much more accurate: designed in California, assembled in China, exposing a humiliating reality that the Chinese Communist Party tries desperately to hide. China is not the factory of the world, but rather the assembly bench of the world. As forensic examination reveals that the screen likely comes from Samsung in South Korea, the glass from Corning in America, the camera sensors from Sony in Japan, and the microchip brain from Taiwan or American designs, meaning China's actual contribution is snapping these pieces together. performing the low-skill, low-wage, high-pollution work of assembly. The economics prove brutal. On a standard smartphone selling for $1,000, China captures roughly $10 to $20 of value while getting the dirty air and exhausted workers, whereas California gets the intellectual property, brand value, and $400 profit margins. This creates what can be described as the Lilliputian effect, where from a distance China looks like a giant because of the sheer volume of goods leaving its ports, but up close it reveals itself as thousands of tiny, low-value companies standing on each other's shoulders, desperately competing for pennies while real wealth flows back to the West. This mathematical problem emerges. If China makes pennies on manufacturing, how does it report an $18 trillion GDP, and where is all that wealth supposedly coming from? The answer lies in the second part of the lie, as China stopped building products and started pouring concrete instead. Driving 2 hours outside almost any major Chinese city reveals forests of empty high-rises, 30 to 40 stories tall, completed, painted, landscaped, and completely vacant, which aren't mistakes but rather the engine of the economy. According to reports, China has built over 600 million permanent buildings, constructing enough square footage to house the entire population of Earth. Yet tens of millions of these apartments will never have a light turned on inside them because construction in China isn't about supply and demand but about hitting targets. Local officials receive promotions based on GDP growth, and the fastest way to fake growth is borrowing money from a state bank to build a skyscraper. And it doesn't matter if nobody buys it or if it sits rotting in the rain, because the moment concrete is poured, it counts as GDP. This represents what economists call a zombie economy, where in a normal country these developers would go bankrupt and the bubble would pop. But in China, the government forbids the bubble to pop, continuing to lend more money to the zombies to keep them walking, and the cost of this denial is staggering. Goldman Sachs recently estimated the total value of unsold Chinese housing inventory and unfinished projects at $13 trillion, a number exceeding the combined GDP of Germany, Japan, and India, representing 10 times the size of the entire Mexican economy and amounting to $13 trillion of wealth that is actually just piles of bricks earning zero return. This isn't a slowdown but a kinetic failure where they have traded their future for concrete. And the worst part is there's nobody left to live in these houses even if they were finished. Because while busy building empty nurseries, they forgot to have children. The real tragedy of the ghost cities is that nobody is coming to fill them, as walking the streets of Beijing today reveals a phenomenon that terrifies the Communist Party more than any American aircraft carrier. Tempsping, or lying flat. Young people like Han, who is 25 years old with a university degree in intelligence, have quit rather than working the 996 schedule of 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week to build the Chinese dream, refusing to buy houses, get married, or have children, doing just enough to survive and nothing more. Han is the victim of the 421 problem, as due to the one-child policy he is an only child solely responsible for his 2 aging parents, and because his parents were also likely only children, he is potentially responsible for his 4 grandparents, meaning one young man faces 6 elderly dependents. Looking at this math, he realizes the game is rigged and he can never work hard enough to pay for that burden. So he lies flat, and he is not an anomaly, but rather the demographic destiny of the nation. Social engineering of the past created a catastrophic gender gap where for teenagers aged 15 to 19, there are roughly 115 boys for every 100 girls, which sounds like a dry statistic until one realizes what it means biologically. Millions of young Chinese men are mathematically guaranteed never to find wives, will never start families, and will be the end of their family lines. By 2050, it is estimated that China will lose 200 million working-age adults, equivalent to the entire population of Brazil simply vanishing from the workforce. And examining this through a medical lens reveals that a superpower requires a healthy, robust workforce to fight wars and run factories. But China is rapidly becoming a massive nursing home. The healthcare system is already collapsing under the weight of 300 million seniors, raising the question of who will care for them when the West has immigrants and siblings to share the load, but China's one-child generation has no siblings, creating a biological time bomb where one cannot be the factory of the world when half the population is in a wheelchair and the other half is busy pushing it. This brings us to the central comparison of the California paradox. If China is dying, why is California, which also has high costs and aging people, still innovating? The answer is found in the ecosystem, as innovation cannot be built with concrete. And while one can build a tech park in Beijing, fill it with computers, and order people to invent things, it won't work because innovation requires chaos and trust. In Palo Alto, on Sand Hill Road, there exists a messy collision of venture capitalists, lawyers, dropouts, and immigrants where people fail constantly, get fired, and start over. But in China, failure is dangerous because if you fail, you lose social credit, and if you succeed too much like Jack Ma, you disappear. The California system is ruthless and grinds people down to extract diamonds, not a paradise by any means. But this chaotic efficiency is something an authoritarian state can never copy. As China wants the silicon but fears the valley, desiring growth while fearing the freedom that creates it. And that fear is the ceiling that keeps them stuck. They have built the hardware of a superpower but are running the software of a dictatorship, and the software has crashed. The tale of two CEOs illustrates this perfectly through the contrast between Jack Ma, the man China destroyed, and Jensen Huang, who was born in Taiwan, moved to America as a child, and started a company at a Denny's diner in California that became Nvidia. In 2024, Nvidia alone became worth more than the entire GDP of most G7 nations, and Jensen Huang is loud, powerful, and controls the most critical resource on Earth, AI chips. If Jensen Huang had stayed in the East and tried to build Nvidia in Shenzhen instead of Santa Clara, history tells us exactly what would have happened the moment he became more powerful than the local party secretary. He would have been summoned, his supply chains nationalized, his speech censored, and he would have ended up like Jack Ma, quiet, broken, and irrelevant. This is the California paradox in a nutshell, as California is expensive with homelessness, crime, and chaos, but that chaos allows a Jensen Huang to exist, while China offers order with high-speed trains and clean streets, but the price of that order is that a Jensen Huang cannot exist, and the math proves which system wins. Starting with a terrifying number of 1.4 billion people, we end with a different number, 35. Representing that one single Californian generates the economic output of 35 Chinese citizens, which is not a margin of error but a rout. As long as the contest is innovation versus replication, the paper tiger will never become the dragon, and China will remain a great power, a massive regional factory with a powerful military. But becoming a superpower, a nation that defines the future of humanity, requires the one thing the Communist Party can never allow: freedom. The verdict is clear that China is not going to overtake the West, as the math of demographics, debt, and efficiency makes that impossible. Meaning the only country that can destroy the American superpower is America itself, raising the critical question of whether we are currently watching the West debate, abandoning the very model that makes us win. There is a dangerous flirtation with tariffs, isolationism, and state control as we are tempted to copy the Chinese model just as it is failing, potentially committing the same mistake the Ming Emperor made in 1433 by burning our own ships. And this represents perhaps the most crucial question facing the modern world: whether free societies will maintain the chaotic, messy, difficult systems that allow innovation to flourish, or whether they will trade freedom for the illusion of control and efficiency that has ultimately doomed China's aspirations to true superpower status.